I find it really hard to explain to my friends and family what it is that I actually do for a living. And it's understandable, right? Because it's not like I'm a doctor or a dentist or something that someone knows what it is they actually do. What we do, or what I do, is I'm in Dynamics 365, and no one's heard of Dynamics 365, right? And so what I thought would be really cool is to do a video where I talk about Dynamics 365, but I also talk about what it is that I do with Dynamics 365. And I think this is going to be a really cool video for those of you who are just new to the field and you haven't heard of Dynamics 365 and you're looking to get into the field. What kind of things are you expected to do while working on Dynamics 365? So the most obvious place to start is by talking about Dynamics 365. So what is Dynamics 365? It's a set of business applications hosted by Microsoft in the cloud, right? So you can access it any way you want. And these applications are of course aimed at businesses and mostly medium to large size businesses. And they're businesses that are looking to be more efficient with what they're doing, and they want a system that can help them get to that next level. And so these suite of applications within Dynamics 365 consist of a few different types of applications, and they target different businesses. And you can really split these into two categories. Now, I'm not saying that all the applications fit nicely into these categories, but at a high level, you're essentially talking about two categories, right? So one is CRM, also known as Customer Relationship Management. And this is where you've got applications that are really focused on your customers and building that relationship with the customers. You know, how can I keep those customers happy and satisfied, as well as how can I get new customers as well? So all about the customer experience. And then you've got the second category, which is ERP, also known as Enterprise Resource Planning. And Enterprise Resource Planning is more focused on the back-end office functions. So things like manufacturing, logistics, finance, HR, all that kind of stuff, functions that the business needs to operate. The ERP can handle all of those. So keep in mind, these are all individual applications that do have the ability to talk to one another. So they're built very specifically to perform a certain function, and Microsoft have designed it specifically in that way because their intention is, yes, you can add all these different applications as you need to, but you don't need to necessarily have all the applications, right? You can just handpick what you need, but you can be confident that they can talk to one another because Microsoft have built in a whole bunch of integration capabilities into these applications. So imagine you're a business that's just purchased one of these applications. You probably have no idea how to implement this, right? Because why would you have a team of experts within your company that know how to implement Dynamics 365? It makes no sense. But this is where you kind of have a choice as a business. You can either talk to a partner. So a Microsoft partner is a set of organizations who specialize in implementing Dynamics 365, right? So think of massive teams with expert consultants who have, a wide range of experiences, and they've delivered multiple projects and they've transformed multiple businesses with Dynamics 365. So that's one option, right? So you can choose to go on the partner route and choose a partner who can help you make the transition from the old system to the new system. Or you can also choose the approach where you hire a bunch of individual experts, possibly as contractors, to your organization. And so these individual contractors will work together as a group and help you transform from the old system into the new system. So no matter what choice you make, at the end of the day, what the business is trying to do is hire a set of experts or consultants, and they want those consultants to advise them on the best way to make that business transformation from the old system to the new system, as well as, taking all the users of the system with them on that journey. And remember what I said, they are all different applications, right? So either if you're in a CRM application or an ERP application, each one in its own right is massive, yeah? And you need a set of experts in that specific application to help you transition to that new system. So that's a very quick background on Dynamics 365. I haven't got into every single little bit of detail, but I think you've got the gist. So moving on to what I do. And what I do, I absolutely love, right? I've been doing it for about 15 years or so now, and I find it so enjoyable. And it's frustrating in some ways that I can't really explain it to other people because they just stare at me with a blank expression, right? But that's okay. Hopefully they can watch this video and, maybe get a little bit of an understanding of what I do. So that's Dynamics 365 and a little bit about it. I haven't gone into a lot of detail because I could be there all day, right, talking about Dynamics 365, but that should give you a little bit of an idea of what it's all about. But moving on to what I do, I'm currently a technical architect in finance and supply chain management, which of course is one of the applications within Dynamics 365. So I've been doing this about 15 or so years now, and it's a really challenging role, but some things are challenging, but I really love doing it. So let me talk to you a little bit about technical architect and what that involves. So traditionally, a technical architect, well, I guess has kind of different meanings depending on who you ask. And I've experienced this working as a technical architect in my old company and then moving to a technical architect role in a new company. And there was a massive difference between what I did in the old company to the new company. And what I do now, I would say, in my opinion anyway, is what I would consider a true technical architect to do. But obviously everyone has their own opinions and there's nothing wrong with that at all. But I'll talk to you about the things I get involved in. So what I want to do is break down what I do into two different components. You have the technical elements and then you have the non-technical elements. So starting with the technical elements, let's start with data management. So data management is the process usually where the business has to move the old data from the old system into the new system, the new Dynamics 365 system. And there's a whole process in which needs to happen, or a whole process that needs to be followed to do this smoothly and effectively. So what I focus on in my role in terms of data management is ensuring that all the best practices are followed to make sure that the data can be moved from the old system to the new system in an effective way. The second thing I focus on is the integrations. And so when I say integrations, normally when some business purchases Dynamics 365, they'll also have a few other systems that are already part of their ecosystem. And so in a lot of cases, they'll want to keep those systems, but they'll say, hey, look, I want to keep those systems, but I want to make sure that the information can pass from one system into Dynamics 365. And so the passage of this information is what we call the integration, right? So we want to integrate all these other systems with Dynamics 365. And there's a whole way of integrating within Dynamics 365, which I won't go into this video, but what I do specifically is oversee that process to make sure that the correct integration patterns are chosen depending on the specific system that wants to integrate with Dynamics 365. So another thing I focus on is reporting. And when I say reporting, what I mean is, sure, you've got this Dynamics 365 application that people are using, but a lot of the time you're going to have your big bosses come up to you and say, hey, I want to see how well we're doing sales wise. How much revenue have we made in the last month? How many customers have joined us, right? So all these kind of metrics are things that are slightly different, that don't really exist within Dynamics 365. Or well, in some ways they do exist, but in some cases you want a kind of flashy report, and there's different mechanisms and methods in which you can use to display those reports. So I kind of oversee the tools and technologies used to make sure that the right tool is used to get that right report that big boss wants to see. And another thing I look at is security. And now security is massive, right? Because you don't want unwanted intruders going into Dynamics 365 and messing around with your system. So security is always number one for any kind of business, no matter what application they're implementing. So in terms of Dynamics 365, you have security in the sense of within Dynamics 365 and making sure that the users who are allowed to go into Dynamics 365 only have access to do the certain functions they're allowed to do, right? So you don't have someone kind of going in there and running some kind of batch process that completely screws up your system, right? That'll be completely awful, right? So that's why you have security roles in there to make sure you have people who know what they're doing, do the things they're supposed to do. But then you also have security outside of Dynamics 365. And now, because Dynamics 365 is so intertwined with technologies like Azure and the Power Platform, I also now have to consider the type of security we need to consider in those external applications as well. So all of these technical topics I've just covered, I think you probably noticed I don't go into a lot of detail. I'm not really ever into that low level of detail. But what I do make sure is that I'm looking at it from an oversight point of view and from a governance point of view to make sure things are ticking along as they should be. So although I don't go into the details, at some point in my career, I've definitely gone into the details, and that's what's allowed me to get to this role as a technical architect. So I do plan on in the future doing a kind of deep dive into some of these topics, and I think that'll be really helpful for you as well. And so that's the technical element. And a lot of people think as a technical architect, that's all they need to worry about, right? But that's completely wrong, in my opinion, anyway. There's a whole other aspect to a technical architect, and that's the non-technical elements, as it were. So I'll list a couple, and to give you an idea of what kind of things I'm talking about. So first up is communication with your stakeholders. Now, this is a really important one because imagine you're a business and you've just hired, let's say, a partner to implement your Dynamics 365 system. They want to make sure that the team implementing that system knows what they're doing. So as a technical architect, I'm always face to face with the client. So the client needs to be reassured that I know what I'm doing. And the best way to do that is to communicate, and to communicate effectively in a way that gives them confidence to know that the solution is in the right hands. And another thing is commercials. So this, I guess, depends on who you're working for. But let's say you're working for a partner, then the project doesn't just magically happen. Someone needs to inject a lot of money into making it happen. And so normally, if you're a partner, you've probably been given a set amount of budget to implement the project. And so as a technical architect, I need to be very conscious to make sure that the work we're delivering, especially on the technical side, is not just within budget, but if something is going to go out of budget, flag that up very early and then think of the different implications that might involve, right? So it might be, hey, look guys, we're kind of going over budget. What can we do to do this, to solve the problem? And it might be, let's raise a change request because the new thing that's taking so long, it's not even in scope to deliver, right? So we need to make a change request to make sure that we have in scope what we need to deliver and that we have an adjusted budget and timeline to deliver that solution. And another big thing, and one that I love doing, is process improvements, right? Because even within a project, let's say you already have an established ways of working, you still have opportunities to improve the processes that you do on a day-to-day basis. And that's really important because you want to constantly be able to improve the way that you deliver projects to your customers. So if you're not looking within yourself and looking at ways to improve these different processes, you're kind of going to stagnate as an implementer. So my role as a technical architect is to look at ways in which we can improve our processes so the next time we implement something, we're a lot better at implementing it. And there's a whole bunch more topics that I probably can't remember right now, but I will definitely try and cover those in a separate video in a lot more detail. Okay, so I've talked about Dynamics 365 and I've talked about what it is that I do. So now you're probably wondering, okay, fine. So how do you actually implement Dynamics 365, right? And think of it as a journey. So, all right, let's say now you're a business, you've purchased Dynamics 365, you've chosen a partner to implement Dynamics 365. So now let's take F&SCM as an example. What are the next steps, right? How do you actually go from your old system to the new system? So let's focus on F&SCM because that is what I know. Okay, I don't want to talk about stuff I don't know, so let's focus on F&SCM. And for those of you who know a little bit about implementing projects, you're probably aware that there's different ways to implement projects. But typically, when you're talking about an F&SCM implementation, you're talking about a waterfall method as opposed to an agile method. And so waterfall method is where you have different stages, and so you deliver at the end of every stage you have, I guess, an outcome, right? Whereas agile is more iterative and you're constantly going backwards and fixing things and working in a more agile kind of way. And it's a very, very high level explanation of those two concepts. But again, I'll definitely do a video going into a lot more detail about those two different types of implementation methodologies. So F&SCM, when a project starts, it's always this initiation process, right? So this is where you're starting a project, you have to identify what is the goal of the project, what are we trying to achieve, who's going to help us achieve that objective, right? Because who's the different team members, who's part of the business, who's part of the partner, if it's a partner, or who's your set of contractors that are going to deliver the Dynamics 365 solution. So that's your kind of initiation, kickoff, and you usually have kind of a couple of meetings, and then you talk about the tools you're going to use, the technologies you're going to use, and also milestones and timelines, right? Because it's usually a big implementation, usually takes a long time. So you're going to have to understand when do you expect certain elements of the project to be completed by. Keep in mind, some projects I've worked with, they last a couple of months, but then I've been on projects that last years, right? So you can imagine being on a project that lasts years. It's really important to set those timelines and objectives at the very start of the project. And so another thing that usually happens at this stage is the requirements gathering. And when we say requirements gathering, it's essentially saying, okay, you've got this new system coming in. What is it that you'd want the system to do? And at this point, it's very easy to fall into the habit where they say, look, we've got our old system that does X, Y, Z, and now I want my new system to do that, right? And that's a trap a lot of people fall into. But what we do now, and it's very common nowadays, is everyone's kind of learning about this, which is avoid doing that, but instead focus on what you'd like the new business to do. And don't just put it into the new system just because it works in the old system, because the new system probably does it in a much better way. So those are your requirements. So you want to understand what are your requirements and what is it that you want the new system to do. So the next stage is what we call the analysis stage. And in the analysis stage, the first thing you look, there's obviously a lot of things that happen, but I'm just talking about the key components, right? So one really important part of the analysis phase is the gap analysis. So you remember we talked about the requirements and what you want the new system to do. You also have to be aware that the new system might not always be able to do what you'd want it to do, right? And this is where you have a gap analysis. So you say, I've got a whole bunch of requirements. Out of these 100 requirements, maybe 80 of them the system can do, and then 20 of them the system can't do. So immediately you know that, oh, hey guys, we got to do something about these 20 or so that the new system can't do. So that's typically called the gap analysis phase. And in that analysis phase, towards the end of it, you're also looking at defining how the solution works at a high level. And what I mean by that is, what are the tools and technologies you're going to use to fulfill the requirements that you just identified? Yeah. So you just said, hey, I want to do, 80 of these are fits, as in the Dynamics 365 system can achieve it. And then you've got 20, which are gaps. But then how are you going to actually achieve those fits and gaps? What are the high level modules you're going to implement? What are the functionalities within Dynamics 365 that you're going to utilize to achieve the goal of those 100 or so requirements? And so the next phase is the design. Now, this is where you've identified your requirements. You kind of have a high level idea of how you're going to do it. But what you need to do in this phase is go into a bit more detail and go into that low level of detail and think about how you're going to actually achieve those 20 or so gaps that you've just mentioned, right? So you said you've got 20 or so gaps. How are you actually going to achieve that, right? Is it going to be a report? Is it going to be an integration? Is it going to be a customization of F&SCM, right? There's different ways in which you can achieve the solution for those gaps. And so what we do typically is we have design documentation, and this is unfortunately the boring part for consultants, right? They have to write typically what's known as kind of functional design documents that are kind of not necessarily massive documents, but it does go into the detail of how you plan to achieve these gaps. And I'm so glad, as a technical architect, I don't need to write any design documents, not functional design documents anyway, because it's not part of my role. And to be honest, it's so tedious. I'm so happy that it's not something that I need to do. And another thing that gets discussed in that design phase is also data, right? So remember, you're going from an old system to a new system, and so therefore you have a whole bunch of data that you have to get into the new system. So you have to ask yourself, how are you actually going to do that, right? What are the tools, again, tools and technologies you're going to use to get that data into the new system? But also, what are the individual elements of data that you need to migrate? So I know, let's say you've got to migrate sales orders and your customers and your journals, right? There's a whole bunch of elements or entities, as we call them, that you need to migrate into F&SCM, and you really need to think upfront about how you are going to achieve that. What's the volume? How quickly do you have to achieve that? Okay. So moving on to the stage after design, that's the build. So the build is where stuff actually gets done, right? Because you've done this whole bunch of analysis and design, whole bunch of documentation, and now you're ready to do the actual building. So I kind of touched on it a little bit earlier in the design section. So you can kind of think of it split into a few different categories. You typically have your customizations. So that's where you said, okay, the system doesn't really do what I need it to do, so I need it to be tweaked in a certain way. So that's where you're customizing F&SCM specifically to achieve that gap that you want the new system to do. So that's your customization. And then you've got integrations, which is where you have all your external systems where you need to get information into Dynamics 365 or out of Dynamics 365. So we call that integration, and there's a whole bunch of different ways that you can integrate to Dynamics 365. And then you also have the data element of it, right? So now you've done your whole design on data, and now you're ready to build your data migration element of it. How are you actually going to do the migration of data from your old system to the new system? Okay, so you've done all that build work, right? All that hard work gone into building the solution, those 20 gaps you've toiled away, and now that's all finished, right? But then you've got to test it, right? How else are you going to know if what you've built actually works? So testing is also split into a few different categories. You have unit testing, which is typically done during the building phase, but then you've got a kind of like a SIT or system integrated testing phase where you're putting together all the different elements that you've built and seeing if they work with one another. And then you've also got user acceptance testing. And that's where typically it's the end users that are now finally able to get their hands on the solution that you've built, and they can give you feedback to say, okay, does it work as I expected it to be working? And the final phase is the deployment phase. So this is where you've done all your building, you've done all your testing, and now you're ready to go live with your new system. And so typically this happens over a weekend, because that's when the business is typically at a low period, so there's not much activity going on, and in most cases the business completely shuts down for that weekend. And so you have this process where you migrate the data from the old system to the new system, and you make sure that everything that you built is also in the new system. So typically you have your production system ready to be migrated into on let's say the Friday before you go live on the Monday. And that's the big bang. I guess that's when you go live, and then on Monday everyone logs in, and fingers crossed, hope that everything you've done works as it should. So that's kind of like the framework in which how F&SCM projects are implemented. But again, every project is unique in its own way, and depending on who is implementing Dynamics 365, they'll have their own different ways of working. So someone watching this might think I've just completely butchered the way of implementing Dynamics 365, which is, completely fine. There are different ways of implementing, like I said, but these are the typical kind of stages you have to go through to get from no system to working Dynamics 365 system. So hopefully that's kind of giving you a little bit of an insight into what is it that I do, what's Dynamics 365. So the next time someone talks to you and says they're a Dynamics 365 consultant, you actually know what they're talking about. So I hope you've enjoyed watching this, and stay tuned for more videos.